I'm doing a professional doctorate in education at Oxford Brookes. At the same time I teach at a different university, and I teach higher education practice and philosophy. So about what we feel that education means, how that influences the way that we teach in higher education. So that's what I teach. And I'm also doing this professional doctorate. Professional doctorate is slightly different to a PhD. It's the same level academically, but you're the research focus. You're researching yourself as a teacher, your teaching practice, the institution in which you work, your students, etc. So slightly different to a PhD. There's no pretense of objectivity there at all, really. So I'm doing this professional doctorate, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm interested in regards to that. I'm really interested in ideological difference, why we think differently, and about peace and conflict. And given that we all think differently, can we somehow overcome that and make the world better? Given my work, I'm looking at that whole idea through this lens of what we think universities are for, which is a hotly debated question. It's been debated for a good couple of 100 years, and then before that, way back to ancient Greece. John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman, he was one of the first people to write about this at length back in the 19th century. That's what he felt that universities were for. I've chosen this more up-to-date quote by the chair of a think tank called Universities UK because it's an example of a modern-day view of universities that I radically disagree with, I guess. And that's because, well, let me go back. So, institutions are academic, not therapeutic communities. Personally, I think I disagree with this because I feel like education and therapy are very much intertwined. It's not so much that I think that therapy is a certain kind of education. I think they're both about thinking about thinking. So about looking at how we're thinking, learning about thinking. But I will move on because I'll come back to all this stuff. What has this got to do with psychedelics? So in my third year, I'm in my fourth year now, we were asked to write an essay to transfer from the master's stage to the doctoral stage of the course. And they told us to write an autoethnography. Now, an autoethnography is a form of research which looks very much at yourself. So it's illuminating a particular academic topic using yourself as the example. So picking something maybe typical or unusual about your own journey to illuminate that phenomenon. And the phenomenon under study was doctoral learning, doctoral study. And so we were given a few examples of this kind of work to look at. And what I enjoyed reading it. It was all kind of very story-based, very enjoyable to read. If any of you are doing doctorates at the moment, you might have heard of the Thesis Whisperer, which is Inga Newburn, and her work was one of the examples that we were given. She has a website called the Thesis Whisperer where she gives people tips on how to finish their doctorates. And what I felt all of them had in common was there was this sense of identity, about your own identity as a doctoral student, becoming a doctor. There was a lot of emotion in there, so a lot of it was quite negative emotion, stress, the pain, the unbearable pain of doing a doctorate. And there was also a sense of the banal, the everyday. And I didn't want to write about that, I wanted to do something different. I did enjoy reading this, but I wanted to do something different. And the tutor who was running our course, Ian, he had presented this idea to us as autoethnography as very much the kind of thing that the previous speaker was talking about, an opportunity to violate moral and social boundaries and research boundaries, a different form of knowledge, allowing voices that have been previously silent to speak out. And that really spoke to me. Something else that I recalled at the time was that I'd been to a festival back in 2013, Secret Garden Party Festival. Anyone been to the Secret Garden? Yeah. Last one coming up soon. And at the festival, there was David Nutt and Robin Carr Harris were there at the festival in the science tent, and I went to hear them talk. And at the end of the talk, there was questions from the audience, and someone said, David, what can we do? What can we do to help public understanding of psychedelics? And he said, well, I can see you all, and you all look like nice people, and you've all got probably good jobs. And I think you need to probably be more open about what you do, about the drugs that you take, and that is going to help really shift public perception into the potential benefits of these substances, you know, just on an everyday level. And that really spoke to me. That was the festival. The theme was luck. I was dressed as something blue, and they were rabbits with missing feet. So I was very lucky to catch that, I think. So that prompted me to email my tutor. I said, hey, this is what I'm thinking about doing. What do you think? You don't have to read all of that. I think the interesting thing was, so I want to explore the influence of these experiences on my doctoral work, because I started to see kind of parallels and see the way in which my thinking was moving, the way in which my writing was moving was very connected to the things that I was experiencing. And he said, great, this sounds really interesting. I am a bit worried that about your place on the programme being jeopardised. He was worried about the student regulations, about the taking of illegal substances. He was also worried about the new things coming in many universities about cognitive enhancement and the use of neurotropics, and if I was to claim that I was gaining some sort of advantage from taking drugs, that would be not good for me. So I had also mentioned, I didn't use the word hypocrisy, because I don't think people who do scientific research into psychopharmacology are being hypocrites when they don't talk about their drug use. I think that's necessary in order to avoid any accusations of bias. That was Ian's word. So we asked the Director of Studies, and he was pretty amenable to the whole idea as well. He did make some funny assumptions about that what we're trying to do with our feedback is help her to consider better, more sensible, healthier recreational options. And that really wasn't my goal at all. But he didn't know much about what I was going to be writing, and I didn't say anything about that at the time. I thought, well, you'll see what I'm going to say. So there were some conditions. We do not condone her taking more drugs in order to get the experiences necessary to complete the assignment. Which, of course, I didn't. Of course. What happened now? Where are we now? Okay, so Ian said, yes, Graham said, right, and, whatever. If you're okay with these conditions, of course, then please go ahead. And what was really nice is that obviously I'd sent him, a link to Breaking Convention and some things that various people had written, and that he'd say, well, I'm going to check some of this stuff out, which was really nice. So, that was fun. I don't really want to go through the paper in detail because it's online and you can read it. I think the more interesting story is actually this kind of stuff, the writing of it and the negotiation and the reaction and so on, and what happened to me as a result in my life. But I will tell you a little bit. I enjoyed reading. This was probably my favourite reading list for any of the assignments I've done for the doctorate so far. So there was Carl Rogers, and there was also David Nutt's book, Doors of Perception, both the collections of work that came out of Breaking Convention conferences, some stuff on human enhancement, William James, so on. So really, really good fun. I really got into it. The kind of ideas that I ended up, I guess, maybe generating or pulling together in the assignment went really, and it was only a short assignment, we're talking 3,000 words, and in that I kind of was very, very briefly talking about things like empathy and I guess the universal value of thinking about thought, the therapeutic approach. I did talk about cognitive enhancement a little. I talked about thought itself, the connection between and the disconnection of thought and language, so disrupting that. Truth, which is admittedly a big topic. And I also touched on this tension that I was feeling about, because I was writing about psychedelic experience and making a kind of argument for it supporting my education. There's a tension there, I think, about using these substances for ends that are extrinsic to itself. Who sets those ends, the notion of value, and so on. So that was the kind of thing I was writing about. I also used a writing technique where I used what I called epiphanic fragments, which are essentially just little snippets. I'm not a very poetic writer, but I was doing my best, I suppose, to encapsulate these moments of shifts in my own perception. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. Oops, skipped one. Skipped two. There we go. Another thing I spoke about was co-reminiscence, so the experience of talking with other people who had similar experiences about my experiences. And yeah. Yeah. So allowing this further significance, the role of trying to talk about this and trying to put it into words, perhaps. This is tricky, this. I found myself using the word resonance a lot in my writing, and I don't usually like metaphors, but resonance is something that I think I like. If you're not familiar with resonance, you might remember learning about it at school in physics class. It's okay, that doesn't really make a nice sound, but I didn't realise it was plastic when I wanted to do that, but now I do. But the idea is that all physical entities have their own natural frequency at which they vibrate. Everything's vibrating all the time. And when two vibrating things, I guess, affect each other, when they resonate, you know that they're resonating when that vibration amplifies, like a tuning fork, for example. And this idea was coming up all the time, and I think this... my very terrible attempt at poetic writing. I'm trying to write about what I was experiencing when I was looking out over the lake, and I was looking at this bank of trees, and they were moving in the wind, and I could feel my blood going through my body, and I suddenly realised that we were pulsing in time with one another. And it wasn't just that; it was the sense of, I guess, kind of mutual knowing that went between me and the trees. And yes, and Alan Watts, the moment I read this in Alan Watts, and I was, oh my God, this stuff about, you know, the trees are waving, your blood is circulating, it's the same thing. So there was resonance between me and nature, and resonance between what I was experiencing and what someone had experienced, you know, 50 years ago, and that was exciting, reassuring, lots of positive things about that. So that's what I wrote about. I also discovered while I was researching for my paper Jim Fadiman's work on microdosing, and started doing it myself. And I don't know if I've got time to go into this exactly. Maybe if anyone else wants to talk to me about microdosing or my experiences of doing that and what happened as a result, maybe grab me at some point in the conference, because I don't think I've got really time to go into it here. But I will talk about it again in another context in about 5 minutes. So that was interesting. At the same time as writing my autoethnography, I had to do another assignment. I had to write my research proposal. And this was for another tutor, a different tutor. A tutor who I didn't like so much as the others. We didn't really get on. I think there was something that made me not respect her, and we had quite a difficult relationship, I think. And when I presented my research proposal, I thought, I'll just throw this in and see what happens. And I mentioned that when I was thinking up my research project, my idea for my thesis, at that moment, the moment I generated that idea, I'd actually taken nitrous oxide. So I'd inhaled this balloon of nitrous oxide, and I thought, think, what are you going to do for your thesis? I'm very instrumental like that, you know. And it came to me, and this idea of ideological difference and mediation and so on. I thought, wow, that was good. And so I threw that into the presentation very briefly, and nothing happened. So no one kind of said, hey, hang on a minute, you can't say that, or what are you talking about? Don't do that. No mention of it in my feedback, so I thought, okay. And also Ian had said I could write about this for this other assignment, so I guess maybe, was it getting cocky? Was it, I don't know, I just kind of felt that I could. And so when I was putting my research proposal together, I mentioned the nitrous oxide, I mentioned other experiences that I'd had that contributed to the motivation for my thesis project. Dun, dun, dun. You know, at school when you do a bit of homework and then the teacher writes "see me" at the bottom. And some of you, maybe that didn't happen, but this was very much a kind of, oh dear, what have I done? She said, I need to speak to you straight away. Can you come in? I was like, no, you're in Oxford and I'm in East London. I can't come in. Can we Skype? So we Skyped, and she didn't tell me what it was about, which I hated, because I saw it as kind of a power play. You know, when someone wants a meeting with you and they don't say what it's about, and I didn't want to show weakness by saying, what is it about? So I spent 24 hours kind of chewing myself up over this. So these are the kind of words that she used when she was talking about what I'd written. And it was quite nerve-wracking. I got quite kind of emotional, I suppose, and I was trying to put my case, and I was trying to, you know, present why I'd said what I'd said. But she was very clear that she wasn't going to mark the assignment, and it wasn't going to go through and pass unless I took all mention of psychedelic experience out of my research proposal. And it's funny because up until this point, up until this week, I've always kind of blamed her for this and felt that she was being unreasonable. But then when I was putting this together, this presentation together, just a couple of days ago, and realising the intricacies of the conversations that I'd had with Ian and Graham previously in the other assignment, and I hadn't afforded Deb any of this kind of, any of that. And I just presented her with it. And up till this point, I hadn't really appreciated how shocking that might have been for someone who had no experience of this. And I was also quite rude. I was quite sarcastic in my response to her when I sent her my revised, sanitised version of my assignment. And I read that and I kind of wince, I think. So, yeah. Graham seemed to like it. So, yeah. A couple of months after that, once she'd passed that, and I passed the Autoethnography, that was fine. And I was still microdosing. And so a couple of months after this, the Mail on Sunday got in touch with me via Stephen Reed from the Psychedelic Society, because they wanted to write a piece on microdosing. And originally, it was because this book was coming out, A Really Good Day. Oh, I better explain for those of you who aren't UK-based. The Mail on Sunday is a huge circulation Sunday paper. It's conservative in its political leanings, and it's got a circulation of 1.3 million, which is one of the largest circulations of a Sunday newspaper. And so this book was coming out in January. It was written by an American woman who was an ex-lawyer, 3 children, mid-40s, and she had done this microdosing, experiment on herself following James Fadiman's protocol, which is small amounts of LSD taken every 3rd day for a month. And it had been such a transformative experience for her that she'd written this book. And the Mail on Sunday wanted, I guess what they wanted was they wanted to find a British equivalent. So they wanted to find a woman who had a similar experience to Islet Waldman, who they could conflate the stories, essentially. So you know how newspapers do this. They kind of made out that I was her. They originally wanted to just interview me and write the piece themselves, and after a couple of emails back and forth, they actually just said to me, look, do you want to write it? We'll pay you. I was like, okay. Let me think about that for a second. They pay really well. They pay very well. But it was a big responsibility, and I was very cautious. I was very cautious about what they would do with it, how they would edit it, and so on. And I thought, if I mess this up, this is not going to be good. It's not going to be good for psychedelics and so on, and the whole thing we want to do. So I wrote it. It was quite a complex, nuanced piece, and they stripped it back and did all sorts with it, and they really kind of picked up on various things about it. I didn't make the menopause a big thing in my piece, but I think they wanted to bring that out for some reason. I don't know. Very strange. And you can see how they're conflating my story with Islet Waldman's. I guess because they couldn't get an exclusive interview with her themselves, that's why they wanted to do that. They wanted to include a picture of me. I said, okay, but no shadowy crack den shots. We're not doing that. It's going to be me in the park with the dog, and I want it to look wholesome, please. And so they said, okay, we'll do that. Change my name, no face. There we go. Because we don't want people in my university knowing that I'm dancing around on Class A's all the time. Obviously. It would be bad. So, yeah, there were various things they did in the editing of it that kind of undermined the message I wanted to give. I'd say, first off the bat, I wasn't unhappy with how it turned out. I thought it went as well as it possibly could have done for a British tabloid. But the various things they did to kind of undermine the message, inserting sentences apparently by their legal team for legal reasons, but really, you know, there I am saying this is great, it was awesome, but I wouldn't recommend anyone else did it. It's a contradiction, it's a direct contradiction. And they were saying this is something we have to do legally, but really it's about not pushing their readership too far. It's about their goal as newspaper editors is to carry on selling newspapers, and for their authorship, their audience not to say, oh, this isn't my paper anymore. You know, I'm not going to stop buying it. So this was a more blatant example of how they undermined the message. And they didn't even discuss this with me. They put a block in there, by the Mail on Sunday Doctor, totally decrying everything that I was doing, which is interesting. More subtle ways, I didn't mention MDMA, I was talking about LSD, but instead they show an image of a handful of what I presume are ecstasy pills. And I think the message here is obviously they're all different. They're all different colours, they're all a mishmash of shapes. And the message is, this is dangerous, you don't know what you're getting, they're all different. And that's a very, very subtle message about danger and harm and potential. But despite all this undermining, I think, and the article's still online if you want to check it out, and the comments are quite interesting, I think. And the comments were quite balanced. There was some discussion going on there, obviously a little bit heated. But there were, and you can see how many people liked, you know, which comments. And I think that was quite a heartwarming thing to read, I think. And what was really interesting is that Eilert Waldman's book sold out the next day on Amazon. So clearly people had read it and thought, oh, yeah, which was really nice. So all in all, not bad for the whole idea, and not bad for my bank balance either. Then I had to, say farewell to my brief foray into tabloid journalism and come back to academia. So at the same time, I've been putting together a paper for the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain for their annual conference, which I delivered in March, titled Psychedelic Turn in the Philosophy of Education. And this came back to Aldous Huxley and his book Island, which is his final novel, and it's a utopian view where he sets out a philosophy that is actually very educational. It's a model for society and for education. So I was talking about that and asking them to discuss issues around those ideas and ethics and things like that. And it was very, very well attended, considering it was that first thing on Sunday morning, the morning after the conference dinner. So everyone was very hungover, but they were there, and they really enjoyed it. And I'm also working on a special issue with my supervisor around flourishing education and transhumanism, and really trying to think about cognitive enhancement and moral enhancement as well. And that's kind of a direction in which I'm taking this whole thing. And what I found, especially I think putting together this presentation, is it all comes back to my thesis topic, because this was, up until this point, a bit of a diversion. I kind of felt guilty about doing it, because it's like, what has this got to do with universities? But I was reading this book earlier in the week. It's a book from the 90s by a guy called Bill Readings, The University in Ruins. It's about how we don't have an idea of the university anymore. It's disintegrated, it's all collapsed into a market economy and this empty concept of excellence. And in it he quotes John Henry Newman, whose picture and quote I showed you earlier. And he's talking about, he says, look into the huts of savages and see, For there is nothing to listen to, the dismal blank of their stupid hours of silence. Their professional avocations of war and hunting are over, and having nothing to do, they have nothing to say. And he's talking about literature and what is valuable about literature, I suppose. And that brings us back to, I guess, what the previous speaker, what you were talking about what forms of knowledge we value, what forms of knowledge are valid and recognised even as knowledge. And that made me think. And I also came across this yesterday as well, and this is a nice article, you can Google it. And this is what this guy is talking about here, about different forms of knowledge and about the lack of representation, I guess, in these communities, in these academic Western communities of Indigenous people and their wisdom. And I think it all comes back to this idea that our academia is based around words and things that you can put into words and write about and so on, and that is not the only form of knowledge. So that's kind of it, really. But you can see how it's coming full circle, which I think is quite interesting, and maybe psychedelics will make it into my thesis after all.